All right, thank you. And I will call this meeting to order. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome, board members, DOJ staff, members of the public. This is the second meeting of the year for the RIPA Board's Policy Subcommittee. We will be hearing some updates from the Department of Justice today and continuing our conversation about the policy section for the 2027 report. Let's start with some introductions. I am John Dobard, Vice President of Policy and Programs at Catalyst, California, and an appointee of Speaker Emeritus Anthony Rendon. And who would like to go next?
I'm happy to go next. Good afternoon. My name is Souley Diallo. I'm formerly of the Riverside County Public Defender's Office, currently attorney in private practice. I am a designee of the California Public Defenders Association. And with that, I will turn it over to Board Member Sierra.
Good afternoon. I'm Angela Sierra. I'm an attorney with the California Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Enforcement Section, and I'm Attorney General Brabanta's designee on the board. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. I will pass it on to Rich Randolph.
Good morning. Thank you, ma'am. I am Rich Randolph. I'm a police chief in Southern California, and I look forward to working through some good conversations for the next 2 hours. And I'm also a designee of California PORAC. I'd like to pass it on to Board Member Kajawi.
You're muted. Oh, we didn't. Are you gonna? Oh, you're having issues. Oh, okay. So let's go to Board Member Kazi.
Morning, everyone. Amina Mirza Kazi. I'm a Southern California-based civil rights attorney, and I'm also an appointee of Attorney General Brabanta.
Okay. And let me just ask Board Member Kajabi, do you anticipate having that issue resolved? I assume you're typing something in the chat. Okay. Yeah, no worries. It happens. All right. DOJ, does this cause any issues with quorum or no? Are we good?
This is my first time running one of these meetings and you threw me a curveball question. I don't know. Is one of our more experienced DOJ RIPA team members knowledgeable about that? I'm hearing it causes no problems.
Excellent. Okay. If there are no problems, we can move on. And first main order of business is approving minutes from our last meeting on March 19th. Please take some time to review those meeting minutes if you haven't already done so. And when anyone is ready, I invite a motion to approve.
My apologies. Can I ask if anyone can hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh,
Yes.
great. Okay.
And we're just giving folks a minute to review the meeting minutes from the last meeting. And
Okay.
I mentioned that if whenever anyone is ready, I invite a motion to approve.
This is Angela Sierra. I'll make a motion to approve the March 19th, 2026 minutes.
Can I second that motion? This is Board Member Kajabi. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. DOJ, do we need a?
Yes. So the motion on the floor is to approve the March 19th, 2026 Policies Subcommittee meeting minutes. We'll vote in alphabetical order. Board Member Diallo.
Aye.
Board Member Diallo votes aye. Co-Chair Dobard.
Aye.
Co-Chair Dobard votes aye. Board Member Kajabi.
Aye.
Board Member Kajabi votes aye. Board Member Kazi.
Aye.
Board Member Kazi votes aye. Board Member Randolph.
Looks like he's on a call.
Board Member Randolph, it's your turn to vote.
Aye.
Thank you. Board Member Randolph votes aye. Board Member Sierra.
Aye.
Board Member Sierra votes aye. The motion carries unanimously.
All right, great. So next we will move on to updates by the Department of Justice.
Okay, we're going to hear first from our Research Services Bureau.
Eric, I think you're muted right now.
Yes, I was. But hopefully everyone can hear and see me now. Good afternoon, board members. My name is Dr. Eric Van Holm. I am the principal researcher on the RIPA portfolio at Research Services in the DOJ, and I'll be giving you an update on the work we are completing for the policy subsection. We have begun work with the 2025 data. As a baseline, I wanted to give an overview of what we received. In 2025, we had nearly 5.5 million stops from 535 agencies. Those are both up from 2024 data. It's an 8.3% increase in terms of the number of stops, where we had roughly 5 million even. I don't want to attribute that increase to any one cause, but I will note that CHP reported 400,000 more stops. And so that is sort of a substantial part of where that increase comes from, although agencies always fluctuate year to year. Today, the emphasis of the presentation is on the work we have planned for the policy subsection of the report, particularly the two principal analyses that we'll be completing. That includes a longitudinal policy analysis of some efforts in California to reform police work, both at the local and statewide level. And I'll describe the policies that we'll be analyzing in that section, as those analyses are just beginning and we don't have preliminary data yet. Secondly, I'll discuss the work we're doing on the intersection of race and language fluency and how that impacts actions and outcomes of stops. The first analysis that I'll discuss is the longitudinal policy analysis. This year's report theme is the past, present, and future. And here we look at the impact of specific policies on the past, the present, and the future. We began by reviewing policies passed either at the local or the statewide level for the breadth of time that RIPA has been collected. We only looked locally at Wave 1 and Wave 2 agencies in order to have sufficient observations prior to a policy's passage. to establish a trend, a baseline before policy and after. All agencies, of course, have only been reporting for 4 years now, but Wave 2 and Wave 1 agencies, which there are 15 of, have been reporting for a longer time. And so as part of that, we reviewed local news about those 15 agencies. We looked at press releases. We looked at all sort of every source that we could, trying to find anything that had been implemented that we could also tie to something specific in the RIPA data that we might see change. We also, in each of the past RIPA reports, the document lists statewide efforts that have been enacted, and so we reviewed those as well. And so we have 3 policies that we think are suitable for a policy analysis using the RIPA data. SFPD and LAPD implemented different versions of policies around pretextual stops, which were initially analyzed in last year's report, and so we'll update them. And the state also passed AB 392 in 2019, which provides us a law that impacted all 15 agencies. And so we'll talk more about each of those here. To quickly review, first looking at SFPD, and this graph is from last year's report. The San Francisco Police Commission passed a policy in 2023 that deprioritized stops for 9 specific categories of what they considered low-level offenses, such as license plate illumination or brake lights, which are typically pretextual stops. So, and as shown, there was a decline in stops following the implementation of that policy, which went into effect in July 2024, but that was sort of following the pattern from the year prior of a spike in the summer and then a decline into winter, and November and December matched year to year. And so with only 6 months of data after the policy was implemented, this was sort of a limited analysis. And so we'll be able to update that with another year of data and continue to track what has changed in SFPD. LAPD also passed a pretext policy a year earlier than LAPD, or a few years earlier than LAPD. And what they were attempting to do was requiring a public safety concern before a stop, which was an effort to remove sort of all pretextual stops. This graph shows the number of stops that involve the 100 most common traffic violations divided into moving and non-moving violation, because LAPD didn't target specific codes as SF did. When the pretextual policy went into effect in March 2022, we see a drop in non-moving stops, and that is sort of a new maintained level that they had across those following years. And so we can identify some impact of that policy, and we'll be able to again update this again with another year's data. What we'll add this year is another policy, and this one at the state level, and so it would impact all 15 agencies. It impacted all agencies in the state. We just don't have data for more than those 15. But we'll take a look at this third policy, which was passed in 2019 and took effect in January 1st, 2020. It was passed in the wake of the shooting of Stephon Clark in Sacramento, and it changed the prerequisite for deadly force from what was considered reasonable to when it is necessary to protect the life of the police officer or others. There's been debate about how significant that change is in terms of the language, but it is the first time that the standard was changed since 1872 when it was first established. And so it's a worthwhile effort to see if there is a change in how police interact following the passage of that law. RIPA data contains 3 levels of force, and so we can see whether lethal force changes at either sort of a overall count of incidents or percentages, and see whether there was a shift towards less lethal or non-lethal force being used more as the law was established. And again, this will be limited to just those 15 Wave 1 and Wave 2 agencies. We'll analyze all 3 of those policies this year using what is called an interrupted time series. This is similar to the work we did last year, but with this report, we'll do an interrupted time series, which attaches precise figures to the changes that we observe. An interrupted time series, it's a common method for policy analysis, and it identifies 3 specific time points: the trend or slope prior to an event, which in this hypothetical example up here is something increasing. It identifies the change when that policy goes into effect or when some event occurs, and here hypothesizing a drop in whatever that trend was. And then you can identify third, the slope or the trend after the policy, which might decline, which might stabilize, which might go back to prior growth. And so interrupted time series allows you to identify those 3 points and to do hypothesis testing to understand how substantial those changes are. The outcomes that are being studied are determined by each policy, and it has to be sort of closely tied to what you would actually expect to change as a result. Otherwise, you'll get a false negative. So for the pretextual policies, we'll look at the overall trends and stops in LA and SF. We'll also look at some of the racial differences that may arise as the ending of pretextual stops may impact different groups differently. We can also look at discovery rates as pretextual stops are used sometimes as sort of a way to initiate search. And so there are a few outcomes that we can look at in those cases. For AB 32, we'll primarily look at force used and whether there is less incidence of lethal force after the passage of that law. The second set of analyses concerns the interaction of race and English fluency. RIPA data does not directly collect anything on citizenship status, but there was an interest in understanding whether language fluency and race compound each other. We know from past reports that there are differences in the rates of actions taken and outcomes that occur as a result of stops across different groups. And in the past, we've looked at race and language as 2 separate factors. But for minority groups, are the differences greater for those that are not perceived as being English fluent? Do minority groups or do individuals within minority groups that tend to have more unequal treatment have larger differences when English is a factor? This can be considered a proxy for immigration, since some immigrants don't arrive with language skills. And so given the changes in the political landscape the last few years, there was an interest in studying whether these differences may have grown over time as well. And so we will look at a number of actions and outcomes that are listed here, which is kind of a comprehensive look at stops. We'll be looking at persons removed by vehicle by order or by physical contact, whether a field sobriety test is conducted, whether a curbside detention occurs, whether there's psychiatric hold, whether there's handcuffing, firearm being pointed, asked for consent to search was conducted, and contraband found. And those were selected as sort of a comprehensive look across the stop, but also things where there could be a hypothetical language barrier that may influence how the individual stopped and the police may interact. We are looking at most of the racial groups that are available, but we did remove 2, and that is just because of small counts. We removed Native American and Pacific Islanders. That's because for those groups, first, they're small in the state overall in terms of the number of stops. And then when we get into sort of this minority within a minority of those perceived not as speaking English, you get into very small counts of any of these things occurring. There is single digits of the number of Native Americans not perceived as speaking English that had field sobriety tests conducted. And so it'd be very hard to sort of estimate differences when one group is so small. And so for statistical reasons, it's better to just remove them from the analysis. First, we just start with this sort of broad overview, and these are the percentages in 2025 of each racial group where the individual was perceived as being fluent in English. The only group below 90% is Hispanic Latinx at 89.5, with Asian as the second, not sure how to put this, second most common to not be perceived as English fluent at 91.5. But the vast majority of all the racial groups are the individuals stopped are perceived as being English fluent. For Black, it's 98.7% of stops. For white, it's 98.06%. And so we're looking at sort of a small minority within some of these racial groups, although in the case of, other than the case of Pacific Islander or Native American, those groups are large enough to sort of estimate differences. As I mentioned earlier, there is a long list of variables we're looking at, and we've completed preliminary analysis. And so I wanted to share one set of analyses to illustrate what will go into the report and give you a better picture of what this analysis can kind of show. We could be here all day if I talked about everything that we've started, but today is just a sample. I'll discuss the percentage of individuals removed by vehicle based on their race and English fluency. And we can sort of hypothesize that a verbal order given by an officer may be more easily understood by those that are English fluent. and that may influence how an officer uses them. And so how do the chances of that occurring differ across racial groups? And how does that vary within races based on English fluency? And so the data is first broken down by racial group with the 6 different groups across the x-axis. And then the left bar shows the percentage of stops featuring this action, removal by vehicle by order, showing that for those that are perceived to be English fluent. And then the right bar within each racial group, the slightly lighter one, is those that are perceived as not being English fluent. And so we'll work from left to right. And we'll skip over some of this too. So, but first, Asian individuals, we see that 0.97%, roughly 1% of stops, those perceived with English fluency that are Asian or that are perceived as Asian, are ordered out of their car by verbal order, while 1.32% of perceived Asian with limited no English fluency are removed by vehicle by order. And so that's a small gap of about 0.35 in 2025 between those two groups. And those with limited English language skills are being ordered out of their vehicle more often. The rate of removal by vehicle by order is larger for Blacks, regardless of language fluency. And the gap based on language fluency is larger for Blacks as well. So with those that were English fluent, were about 2 percentage points more likely, or had a rate 2 percentage points higher of having a removal order. And that is the opposite trend from Asian, where those with limited English fluency were more likely. And again, the rate for Blacks of being ordered to be removed by their car by order is higher regardless of language. Hispanic, Latinx, 3.2%, 3.27% of stops for English fluent removed their car by order, while 4.6% of stops for those without English fluency did as well. That's roughly 1.5 percentage points more. I don't want to sort of belabor the data here and go over just reading all the numbers, because I think some of the greater insights comes from looking across these things. And so we can see that in 3 groups, that those that have limited no English fluency have higher rates of receiving an order to be removed by the car. And those are Asian, Hispanic, Latinx, and Middle Eastern, South Asian. And those are the 3 groups with the largest shares of limited no English fluency. Whereas those that are Black, multiracial, or white, which have lower percentages of limited no English fluency in general in the data, had the opposite trend. And so we're looking at a host of variables and pulling out some interesting trends out of this. And like I said, this is just a sample, which will do similar work for all of those actions or results that I described earlier. I know I have limited time. I'm already at the time or over. I could give a preview of the multi-year longitudinal analysis, but that would take substantial time, and it's even more data. It's this graph across different years for each group. And so I will leave it there today. That is, I think, a good preview and an overview of what we're intending to do in the policy subsection. I think gives everyone enough to provide any feedback of things that they'd like to see added or changed, or if there are any suggestions. And so I look forward to any questions or comments you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to turn it over to the next presenter, but if there's a question or a comment, please.
Please proceed.
Okay. The next DOJ presenter, please begin the presentation.
Sorry, did board member Randolph have a question?
Yes, I was just about to acknowledge that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chairman Dobar, and thank you, Board. Real quick, I just had some questions here on that last presentation. So
Sure.
I just want to confirm, so we're going to remove the the Native American, the Indian prompt because the data numbers were low, correct?
Yes.
So then I'm asking for what I would suggest is if we're going to do that, then the directive needs to come from DOJ for next year. That directive is going to be that we're no longer collect that data because that data is still being collected. It's additional workload for the peace officers and the people that are corroborating that data to DOJ. So that's number one. I want to throw that out for the committee to think about that. The next thing I wanted to bring up, I was concerned on the we're talking about the taking people. I just want to confirm we're not collecting data that we're taking people out of the cars because they don't speak English. That's not, am I reading that or hearing that correctly?
So let me clarify both points.
Okay.
So Native American is removed from that analysis and Pacific Islander, not because there are so few Native Americans total in the data, but in the case of Pacific Islander, in the case of Native American, there are very few that are perceived not English fluent. And so we'd be comparing one group to another that has 3 instances. We'd be comparing 100 to 3. And so when you're looking at the rates, when you're looking at sort of the rate of something happening for 3 people, the numbers just fluctuate and you don't get a very accurate impression of whether that's happening. And so that it's not that there are very few Native Americans or Pacific Islanders in general in the data. It's just specifically looking at some of these specific actions because we're breaking it down into very small sort of cuts of the data. And so that's the reason that we did that statistically for this analysis, because it's getting narrow and we're trying to do sort of statistical testing to analyze the differences between these groups. For that variable, what we're looking at, removal by order, there's nothing implicit about language in the action of an officer removing someone from vehicle by order. We're looking at whether the person is removed by order more often or less often if they are perceived as being non-English fluent. And so trying to understand how stops differ for those groups based on English fluency and the ability to communicate. And so there's no separate actions collected based on language. It's just one of the demographics.
Okay, I'm glad you clarified that. Thank you. But when we're talking about taking someone out of a vehicle, how could you do the correlation's confusing? Because if I walk up on a car and there's a gun in the vehicle or there's a weapon in the vehicle, I'm going to take that person out of the vehicle. We don't know. Sorry about my radio. I apologize. The subject's wanted for an arrest. Things of that nature. If I walk up on a vehicle and someone speaks Spanish, I'm going to get a translator. I'm going to use my phone and we're going to do translation. We could actually do our dialogue on the side of the road. I'm just thinking and I want the committee to think of the damaging of statements of saying that we're ordering people out based on people's language preferences because the perception is inaccurate. I just wanted to throw that out there. And then the last thing is, I've talked about before, if we're going to start talking about data here, then I want to know if people went to jail, if they were arrested. Okay, because we're not collecting that information. So, sorry. That was it.
This is Angela Sierra. I just wanted to follow up on that for a moment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think a couple things on Chief Randolph's, your comments and observations. I think that, maybe what we can do in this chapter is just make very clear in this discussion that, we're not, this is not to draw any conclusions from this one data point alone. This is one factor that could be relevant in thinking about future policies if more often than not, folks in one community who are not English speakers, for example, are being removed from the car. Are there actions, like you noted, translators and other things being employed? And I think, though, as Eric, as I understand your explanation of this as well, that you're going to be adding other data points to this analysis. So after people are removed from vehicles, what are we seeing in terms of next actions taken, broken down by English speaking, non-English speaking? And again, it'll probably be impossible to draw any one conclusion, but it's data that we might start seeing trends and may have, more issues to explore because of that. So, so I think it is going to be really important to see what other steps after individuals are removed from a vehicle are happening to the extent that we can also look at that data. So, Eric, if I understood you correctly, my understanding is that that will be in the report, or so far that's the intention.
Yes, yeah, there'll be about 10 actions and outcomes that we'll be setting. And so it's to try and provide a comprehensive look at the entire stop. I presented one variable, one analysis today just to get sort of a snapshot. That wasn't meant to imply that that was all we were doing. There isn't a special interest in, removed from car by order. We also look at removed by car by physical contact. There are many other things that we're going to look at to try and understand sort of the differences in experience.
Okay, I think we're good to proceed.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Janelli for the next part of DOJ's presentation.
Can everyone see, or should we zoom in a little bit? I'll take the silence as a sign that we're good. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janelli Orozco Alcala. I'm a Deputy Attorney General in the Civil Rights Enforcement Section of the California Department of Justice. And today, Ken Sugarman and I will be walking you all through the draft chapter of the policy section for the 2027 report. I will go over the first half, 1 through 4, and then Ken will go over the remainder of the chapter with you all. So as the subcommittee has discussed, the central theme of this year's report is past, present, and future. And the drafters of the policy section kept this lens in mind when we drafted the section. Starting with section 1, the introduction. The introduction presents our theme, past, present, and future, and provides a brief overview of the material in the rest of the chapter. And the introduction can be found on page 1 of the longer draft that was circulated to you all. Section 2 is titled Longitudinal Analysis of Racial and Identity Group Disparities Following Reforms. And this is also on page 1 of the longer draft, and it examines the past by assessing whether the adoption of RIPA recommendations by California law enforcement agencies has led to measurable changes in the data that the agencies report to RIPA. This is something that the subcommittee discussed at length during the March meeting. And you just heard more about this analysis from Research Services. Right now, the draft does note that this content is under development, but we expect that it will be further developed by the July full board meeting. Turning to the present, section 3 analyzes the impact of recent immigration enforcement actions on state and local policing, and this can be found on pages 2 through 10 of the longer draft that was shared. First, the section provides a brief overview of the case Nome versus Vasquez Perdomo, a case in which 3 Pasadena men were detained without warrants by immigration agents who were in unmarked cars and did not identify themselves as immigration agents. The Supreme Court's ruling in that case has essentially indicated that immigration agents may conduct stops to inquire about someone's immigration status based on a combination of factors, including someone's perceived race or ethnicity, whether that person speaks Spanish or English with an accent, their perceived profession, and their location. Justice Kavanaugh issued a concurring opinion in this case, noting that these factors in combination may establish reasonable suspicion that someone is unlawfully present in the United States. And this has led to the rise of the term Kavanaugh stops, which refers to immigration stops based on these 4 factors. The section also includes a discussion of recent reporting of U.S. citizens detained during immigration enforcement stops in the first 9 months of this administration. And the reporting has helped California residents understand how immigration enforcement has affected California's diverse communities. And it also highlights for state and local law enforcement officers how immigration enforcement may impact the individuals that they serve. And this discussion can be found on pages 3 to 7 of the longer draft. Next, this section discusses California laws and how RIPA prohibits racial and identity profiling and the way it interacts with federal immigration efforts. The section also discusses SB 54, the California Values Act, which allows state and local law enforcement officers to participate in joint task forces with federal agents under certain restrictions. This discussion can be found on pages 7 through 10. We've also provided an overview of arrests made by joint task forces, as well as those made for the purpose of immigration enforcement by all task force participants, including federal law enforcement agencies. And you can see those figures on page 10 of the draft. I'll also drop a link in the chat where you can see all of the reports from 2018 to present. For details on SB 54, there is an information bulletin that was issued by the California Department of Justice in 2025. And I'll also drop a link to that report in the chat. Lastly, as you can see on page 11, we have section 4, which is dedicated to an analysis of perceived English fluency. This analysis will build off last year's report, and we will also have this section build out further in time for the July full board meeting. And I'll turn it over to Ken to walk you through the remainder of the section.
Thank you, Janelli. Good afternoon again, everyone. I am Deputy Attorney General Ken Sugarman. I'm going to turn the subcommittee's attention to section 5 of the policies chapter draft, which is found at pages 11 through 36. Section 5 is divided into 3 parts: automated license plate reader technology, found on pages 11 to 16, technology-assisted police body-worn camera footage review, found on pages 16 to 34, and RIPA stop data, which is found on pages 34 to 36. And I will talk about each of these in turn. Turning to the first section regarding automated license plate reader technology, found at pages 11 through 16. In this subsection, we look at ALPR technology, both what it can do and how it can be used. As noted in the draft, California law requires public notice and comment before ALPR systems are implemented, and some jurisdictions may have implemented ALPR systems that are now being used for purposes that go beyond what was initially presented to the public. Most of the critical attention directed at ALPR systems does not relate to racial or identity group profiling or disparities, but there is a potential for bias in some circumstances. We have also updated last year's reporting on California ALPR data being shared with non-California agencies, including immigration authorities, which leads to potential concerns that our state's ALPR data could be used by immigration authorities that may be engaged in racial profiling in California. The next subsection of the draft is technology-assisted body-worn camera footage review, and this is found at pages 16 to 34 of the draft. Here we have provided some foundational information about police body-worn cameras, their hoped-for benefits, and some of the critiques of how their use has worked in practice. We discussed some emerging technologies that can be used to automate the review and analysis of body-worn camera footage review, including some information and findings related to racial and identity profiling and disparities. Notably, the technologies marketed to law enforcement can be used to spot officer conduct requiring training or other interventions, as well as officer conduct to reinforce positive behaviors and discourage negative behaviors. We also note how technology-assisted body-worn camera footage review could be used in the future to help reduce racial and identity profiling and disparities. That's found on pages 26 to 29. One area discussed is how law enforcement agencies should make body-worn camera footage and technological review tools available to the public and researchers so that more of the potential in this area can be realized. The claims in this section are largely predictive, but we think they are well grounded in the facts of what the technology can do. If the board has any concerns that we are being too speculative in this section, we would like to hear what the concerns are and how we might address them. We also note some additional concerns or topics with BWC footage review for the board's consideration, found on pages 30 to 34. There is value in having a large volume of police body-worn camera footage to review, but there are also storage costs to consider, as well as existing California law on BWC footage retention periods. The draft also discusses the potential risk that technology-assisted body-worn camera footage review could be used as a civilian surveillance and investigatory tool, and the risk that this tool may be disproportionately focused on communities that are already subject to over-policing. The draft also discusses other considerations such as privacy issues, public input, and transparency, which are all important topics for any emerging technology. The final section of the policies draft is titled Stop Data Analytics Tools for Law Enforcement Agencies and is found on pages 34 to 36. This section discusses the value of law enforcement agencies having tools for analyzing their own RIPA stop data on a continuous basis. In general, the discussion is responsive to the board's stated desire that RIPA stop data be more actionable by individual law enforcement agencies. We also have a section 6, on potential recommendations, which is found at pages 36 to 37 of the draft. These recommendations stem from the discussions in the prior portions of the chapter, and they are presented to the board for its consideration. Some of these may change depending on the ongoing drafting and the data that we are currently working on. We are presenting them here for the subcommittee's consideration today. We are eager to hear the board's comments and questions on the policies section draft, and in particular, we welcome suggestions from the board about how to position the topics in the board's chosen framework for this year's report, which again is past, present, and future. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Ken. And let me start just by asking if board members have any clarifying questions for DOJ staff before we open things up for board discussion. Yes, go ahead, board member Kajabi.
I had a quick question while we have DOJ staff here. First of all, the report is tremendous detail, and I'm looking forward to our discussion about it. I was wondering if there was also, unless I missed it, an update about the data dashboard. I know that's not explicitly tied to the draft, but just while we have folks at hand here. Eric, I don't know if that's something you could speak to. And I'm sure I'll ask again when we have our data subcommittee meeting as well, just if there's an update or not.
Hello, Daniel Harmon here. I'm the senior research supervisor. I can talk to the data dashboard. We don't have any large updates on the dashboard other than from the prior meeting. We are going through the review and testing process right now, and we are on track to meet our goals for when it will be released.
Okay, thank you for that. I know we want to move to discussion of the draft, but thanks for that.
Yes, and before we do that, one other clarifying question. I know there's more to come on the longitudinal study, but DOJ has identified 3 policies for further exploration. And clarifying question is whether or not you all have already thought about how those will be presented. Because I'm going to phrase this as a question. Depending on the response, I might have a recommendation. So for on the local policies, have you already talked about how you'll talk about those in relationship to the board's actual recommendation? And I'm thinking about the 2 policies that have already been identified. Those are on pretextual stops. There are attempts to reform it or limit them in particular ways. But as I read the board's recommendation, the board's recommendation was to prohibit pretextual stops. That's what the board recommended the legislature and law enforcement agencies do. And so the clarifying question is, has there already been discussion about how you talk about the board's recommendation in relationship to the local policy that was actually adopted, so that it's clear, here's what the board recommended, here's a policy we're looking at. That policy isn't exactly what the board recommended, but there's enough relationship to it for us to explore it. So I'm wondering how you all are thinking about that, and if you've had conversations about that.
Yeah, that's a bit downstream at this point to have like fully fleshed out. But I think that what you're suggesting is right, that we'll, any policy that connects to a recommendation will tie in, the sort of limitations of how it was enacted, whether it was, fully adopted or in a limited sense, and sort of how that kind of limits, what we're showing. The fact that two police forces have adopted the recommendation, out of 535, of course, is a limitation. And so we'll there's room for discussion of that in addition to sort of how things have changed after the policy was enacted.
Great, got it. Okay, so we are going to start our discussion of the section. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-chair, Andrea.
Thanks so much, John, and apologies for being late, folks. Busy day. Let's turn now to a discussion of the policy section. And thank you to the DOJ staff that prevented draft overview. We now have an opportunity as board members to provide input or reflection on the discussion draft. And we've had some discussion already by way of questions to DOJ staff, but it'd be great if folks had other reflection. Board Member Kazi.
Hi, everyone, and thanks again to the DOJ staff for this tremendous report so far. I have a couple things, but I'll just kind of go in order in the report. So page 9 to 10, we start talking about the Joint Task Force reports. And then we talk on the first paragraph of page 10, the number of arrests made by participants in Joint Task Force that were reported as arrests made for immigration enforcement purposes. And then we saw in 2025, it went all the way up to 300, which is like a huge increase. And so my first question about that is I'm a bit confused of how a participation in a joint task force can be permissible under SB 54, such that the primary purpose of the task force is not immigration enforcement, yet it can lead to arrests made for immigration purposes, especially at that large level. So I'm wondering, what is such a scenario where if the participation is lawful, yet it leads to these arrests made for immigration purposes? So that's the first part of that question. And then the second part is, we kind of just end and say, this could raise concerns. Well, it's raising concerns. So I would love to see that fleshed out a little bit more, actually a lot more, of, what do we think, or what does the DOJ staff think is accounting for such a tremendous rise in just this 1 year? What could that point to? And I think that should be addressed based on what you find in our recommendations below.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that very important question. And DOJ staff, I don't know if you want to address that. It's now, or we can keep going.
I'd like to clarify for that. Just one answer, Miss Andrea, if you'll allow me.
Okay.
Because I don't think DOJ is not going to be able to answer that. They're just looking at the reports. So, Board Member Quasi, one thing I would like to say on the numbers, the task forces, I pretty much would roll the dice that that's not going to be all immigration, if that, but a lot of that's going to be human trafficking, child porn, missing persons. So that's where it is spiked immensely because of the border traffic here in our state. So I will clarify that at least the number has increased at that level.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It sounds like DOJ staff, it would be great to have more context for those numbers and understanding and just thank you, Board Member Kazi, for raising it, and I think the request is clear. Board Member Ford.
Thank you so much. Board Member Kazi mentioned something that triggered a thought as it pertained to the Joint Task Force. There's the concern, and it's not a question, so I'll just mention it's a concern and I'll be out of the way. And that is that in my city, in San Bernardino, they've been piloting, and I'm not sure what other cities are doing it, but they've been piloting these cameras in a particular area. And the area is this downtown area of San Bernardino, not a very large area, but they're pitching them as a pilot. And in that, we're ensuring in some of the committees that I sit on that there is no access to the federal government with these cameras. These cameras are they're piloting and attempting to see how they impact traffic stops, for instance, et cetera, et cetera. So when we talk about the Joint Task Force, one of my concerns is how will, or at least what accessibility should we ever be concerned with that those may go beyond the boundaries of where there's a separation between the two. So when they continue to tell us that nobody's going to get access to these cameras, there's a certain concern that I have of the implementation of them. If nobody's using them, is it purely going to be the city? Or is there at some point, because of whatever parameters there are of separation between the two in the Joint Task Force, that somehow it could go well beyond that? And so just a comment that concerns as to where we are heading with some of these implementations.
Yeah, thank you so much, Board Member Ford. I think, there are a lot of questions around joint task forces, and to the extent that this report could help clarify for the public how they're used and how they interact with the potential for racial profiling or identity profiling. I think the more context knowledge we have, clarity around that, or open questions around that, the more helpful that's going to be in the report, right? So that we're asking questions that can be answered and provided in the report, I think would be extremely helpful. And, including thinking about where we might land in terms of recommendations around joint task forces, right? Because, there's like SB 54, there was a lot of conversation around JTFs and their role, their connection to immigration enforcement and how that could slide, right? So just something for us to keep in mind. We're still going to be looking into data. We're still going to be looking at the policy content of this chapter, and we'll be wanting to be considering policy recommendations as well. Mr. Sugarman.
Thank you. Just to enhance our ability to look into what Board Member Ford has raised, could you describe a little more specifically what you're referring to by pilot study cameras is, I think, how you described it. What are you specifically talking about in that regard?
So one of the things that they're doing in the city of San Bernardino, where I work, is that there's the cameras that have been added to assist the police department in a particular area. It's a specific area in the downtown San Bernardino area, right off of the 215 freeway going north on the east side. And so when presentations were made at one of our committees, I think it was the executive committee for the gang and drug task force that I'm a part of, one of the things that they were talking about were these cameras. Naturally, my concern was the accessibility to these cameras as they're pitching these cameras to extend not just the cameras, but also access to cameras that other NGOs and nonprofits may have around their facility, that you could add a box. It was free. It's a free box that you could add to, like my church, I pastor, which is on the west side of San Bernardino, said to any of the organizations who have cameras with their facilities, if you connect this box, it will also help us to support you all by giving us access to your cameras. And of course, I start thinking of movies, Enemy of the State and things of that nature. Anyway, by the way, so but when I think of the JTF, one of my concerns is how clear and defined are the parameters, and then at one point do they become a little bit more flexible, always under the auspice of safety, where we relegate our securities and our rights. And so the implementation of these, I don't start thinking about the immediate values. I start thinking about the long-term effects of some of these things and how it affects the work that we are doing here.
Mm-hmm.
Hope that answers your question.
It sounds like you're talking about both a combination of automatic license plate reader cameras, and then you're also talking about sort of surveillance cameras that an NGO or another entity might be running. Those are the two different types of cameras.
Yeah, I mean, truth be told, I'm not sure if a license plate reader camera is distinctly different from any camera. And then how does the parameters for the JTF operate in order to ensure our city from the Joint Task Force ever getting access to those things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think like flock surveillance, for example, that's a subject that's under discussion up and down the state. Concerns about how that data is shared or used, and the question I hear pretty clearly from the board is whether JTFs become a mechanism to access surveillance technology of any kind, and something we should be worried about or concerned about or have more visibility on or greater understanding. Are there enough parameters? And that could inform a policy recommendation to the state legislature about, maybe there's a need for more parameters around the JTFs. Maybe there's a more clear need for delimiting at the state level how they can be used. These are great questions, good discussion. So we've heard questions around JTFs, around ALPRs, which is part of our report, other surveillance as it relates to these topics. Board Member Randolph.
Thank you so much, Ms. Guerrero. I just wanted to just check. I know the subcommittee, we did meet on this, and we also talked about the future. And DOJ, thank you for your phenomenal report, but we talked about the future of where we're at since we've been around now for about 10 years. And I know this committee, correct me if I'm wrong, that we had talked about moving forward, right? Like what progress we've done. So I was wondering, because I didn't see it in the DOJ breakdown, where's our progress on the positive side?
And Board Member Randolph, we're on a few different committees together, so I'm trying to remember whether that was a policy discussion or whether we had that discussion as a full board or in another committee. My memory is just not serving me right now. So if anyone remembers that, that would be great.
I know
the
that, I know Mr. Dobard was on there because we agreed to it. That I saw first time ever, I saw a lot of nodding heads for like in agreement, but you are correct. We are on multiple committees. So hopefully it does pop up on our next committee meeting. So, but there's a lot of talk of moving forward. So I just want to make sure that we're not going to forget that.
Yeah, my recollection was that that was a full board meeting and that that was something we were interested in doing in the report just to mark the 10-year. And so DOJ staff, I'm not sure like how you absorbed that prior feedback and where that might sit. And perhaps you recall whether that was full board or a particular committee.
Good afternoon.
Yeah,
Good
go ahead,
afternoon,
Alex.
everybody. I just want to check in, and I do remember having just reviewed the minutes in preparation for this meeting. I don't remember that discussion happening in this meeting, so I will go back and review the transcript for the last full board meeting, which is where I think we had that discussion. And in response, a more full response to your question, Member Randolph, the discussion of look back, look forward, and also including an explanation of the work that law enforcement community members and board members had made in getting the RIPA report started was also one of the things that we had discussed at the full board meeting. So that is going to be reflected in the report.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that clarification. Any other thoughts about the policy draft? I would like to focus our attention on the policy recommendations, but Angela, Board Member Sierra.
Yes, thank you. The one area I just wanted to reflect a little bit on, I thought I'm really interested in our discussion about the review of body-worn camera footage and how it could be really instrumental for law enforcement agencies to help them examine the use of new technologies and helping them examine their body-worn camera footage. I think it's, really important and seems like it could be great help, really helpful to the agencies and to help reduce profiling. And so I'm really glad that we're tackling that. The one issue on that I think that we could expand on, to the extent that we are going to be, or we may be recommending that footage be available to researchers or to the public. I think while we bring it up in parts of the chapter, I think we could expand, to me, the real issues of how to protect privacy rights and issues, if we are going to make those type of recommendations, both the privacy of anybody who is captured on body-worn camera footage and the privacy of officers. And I know in our proposed recommendation, we talk about if there's any legislation that should be taken into account, but it may be helpful to the extent there are any examples anywhere of how that issue could be tackled. I think could be helpful, or even some ideas that researchers or experts have about that, because I think that could be a real barrier and make the sharing of that information problematic. And then the other issue with respect to how agencies can use new technologies in examining their own officers' body-worn camera footage. I think it's important to us to be really clear that, while we're seeing some really promising technologies and advances that law enforcement may be able to use, that we are not endorsing any particular product, and that we have never ourselves tested these products, but that these are just really emerging, very potentially helpful technologies. So those are my 2 points on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Board Member Diallo.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I want to commend the draft of the DOJ staff. I think it covers a lot of bases. with respect to the issues at hand. To follow up on Board Member Sierra's comments with respect to body-worn cam and transparency in terms of how that could lead to alleviating racial disparities in terms of bodies like our work. One of potential continued challenges that may occur at the agency level. I know in our work as criminal defense attorneys, dealing with body-worn cam widely, it's being widely available and used in all sorts of cases. We still do have prosecutorial agencies as well as law enforcement insisting on pretty extensive court orders in terms of its dissemination and use outside of the context of a criminal court case. And I think a lot of that has to do with potential use in litigation, and that is the interest, which is understandable on one level, but to the extent that we're making policy recommendations on the increased kind of use and study of body-worn cam as a policy tool, and asking for increased transparency, that's something that we may have some obstacles at the agency level in dealing with, and maybe that's something should be taken into account and addressed. Secondly, I kind of see the use of the automatic license plate readers as, looking to the future of where we are with body-worn cams in terms of its widespread use, dissemination, relative transparency, comfortable using, understanding how the policies are at the agency level on how body-worn cam is used. We are yet to have that with things like license plate readers and with flock cameras. And it's really a black box in terms of how it's being used, to the extent it's used from agency to agency, how it's being shared. I most encounter and increasingly encounter the use of these technologies at what are called investigatory tools. So from a criminal defense perspective, oftentimes we get things in discovery in terms of things that are intending upon used in evidence. That does happen, but much more rarely so, because sometimes it's used in a combination with other things to the extent that even when issues go to trial, because it could be a tool that is used internally within law enforcement in the combination of other things, there's not necessarily the same transparency you have in terms of how it's being used, because it could be used internally with a combination and where the law doesn't necessarily require disclosure, or the discovery statutes don't require kind of, a real transparent use. Hey, we're using these technologies for this particular purpose. Again, at the agency level, there may be concerns about, disclosing kind of some of the that information to compromise investigations. But I know from the defense attorney's perspective, that's oftentimes a tension. You're trying to even get an understanding on how these technologies are being used in exactly what way, even when it goes to court. So stepping back from a policymaker's perspective, if we're having trouble at that level, I think increasing transparency, understanding of policies on how these technologies are being used are really critical as they're being implemented at a rapid pace, and we kind of don't really have a good track and idea of how, what the full scope of how and why, for what purposes they're being used.
Yeah, thank you so much, Board Member Diallo. So we, both Board Member Sierra and Diallo have moved us into policy recommendations, which is where we will stay unless people have other thoughts about the body of the policy draft. Mr. Sugarman.
I do just want to raise that we have a break scheduled in the agenda.
Yeah.
For 10 minutes, and it's probably time to take that.
Okay, we can do that. We can take a break and reconvene at 1:22. See you then.
Thank you. Okay, it's 1:22. I believe we can resume the meeting.
Great. I just want to confirm we have quorum. Mr. Sugarman?
Let's see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have a quorum.
Okay, thank you. All right. We had left off in our discussion of the report. We were starting to talk about recommendations, and I just wanted to check in to see before we get to recommendations if there are other comments around the body of the policy draft. Board Member Kazi.
Yeah, just actually related to recommendation 2, I feel that the report and the section on the data section on those with perceived limited English proficiency, I know we still have to flesh that out, but I think it would also be helpful to include an overview, a look at what policies and trainings do exist, if any, for those with limited English proficiency, including post trainings. I don't believe there are, and I think having that sort of overview of what exists or what doesn't will help inform the recommendation as well. So that's kind of related to the recommendations, but that I would bring it up.
Thank you. Any additional thoughts? All right, let's turn to the policy drafts section around recommendations. I imagine that these could shift as we deepen the policy draft section. We provide some of the context that's been requested, clarify some things, and these could change. These are proposed, but it's always a good idea for us to get our eyes on these early, because if we want to take these in a substantially different direction or add to or subtract, it's helpful for the DOJ staff to know. Just a note about policy recommendations, that as a matter of practice in the past, we have endeavored to make sure that the recommendations flow from the report. So if we're wanting to make a recommendation that doesn't have any content in the report, then we either should consider dropping the recommendation or adding content in the report, so that it is the culmination of what readers have read. So the DOJ staff has suggested 9 recommendations here. Give you a chance to look over these again. And we have been making comments already about how we could get some clarity or provide more context for these recommendations. So those are noted and appreciated.
I have a clarification question related to one of the prior comments about, I think it was Member Dobart or Chair Dobart's comment about relating policy changes to past recommendations. I know in previous reports we've just kind of had boilerplate language. We hereby, restate prior year's recommendations, but I'm wondering if because this is like a backward looking report as well, should we restate any of those that we've seen? Like, should we have a special section to restate any of those that we've seen had made a difference, or pull those out? And what would be the process for pulling out or calling attention to prior and past recommendations?
Yeah, so I think, we definitely don't want to restate recommendations in the recommendation sections. We can always reference recommendations and, restate them for reference, but we don't want to state them as a new recommendation if we've already made them, right? Board Member Dobar, do you want to clarify what you were thinking in terms of how this report interacts with prior recommendations?
Well, I'll say two things. In reviewing the recommendation section, I was thinking something along the lines of what Board Member Kazi just mentioned. What I was mentioning earlier is just ensuring that we clarify what the board's recommendation with respect to the longitudinal analysis and policy, that in the report, we are clear about what the board recommended, and then at the local level, what their policy actually is, which may not be, it may be a variation of the board recommendation, but not the actual recommendation, and just making sure that we're clear about where that's the case. That said, I was thinking also about along the lines of what Board Member Kazi just mentioned, and I'm wondering if it could be useful. I agree with you, Andrea, about not, we don't need to restate all the recommendations and we don't want to present them as though they're new recommendations. And so there are moments where we can maybe restate recommendations elsewhere in this section, but I do wonder if it's worth having a placeholder here for those policies that are mentioned in the longitudinal section, if it's worth putting a spotlight on those, not those that pass at the state level, but those that, if there's something related to the local level policies, and I'm not entirely sure here, but the point is spotlighting the policies that we mentioned in the longitudinal section, because it's not going to be everything, right? Right now, we've only heard less than a handful that would really be the focus. We've heard really two, but with three different examples. And just wondering if it could be worthwhile to just for now have a placeholder in this, either just before this section or just near this section, where we might want to it may be something new. I don't know. After we review these things, it may be some variation on an old recommendation, but it also might, it may not be. It may be it may be a restatement. But because we're mentioning it in the longitudinal analysis portion, that's why I'm thinking it could make sense to, at this end, make sure we spotlight that so that it doesn't get lost in the section. But it would be narrowly focused on those ones that we clearly identify versus, that would be the lens. That would be the lens for it.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have much here in our draft on the longitudinal section, right? Because it's content and development, but it could be that that DOJ drops it in as a block quote, like, so it's pulled out. It's clear that this was a prior recommendation, and it is in the part of the report that is where it is relevant as a suggestion. Okay, great. Board Member Diallo, you had in your prior comments pointed to an issue of this black box, that we don't have the same policy framework for ALPR and surveillance that we do for body-worn cameras. And you shared some of the ways that happens, and you wanted to encourage increasing transparency, balancing privacy and transparency. So I didn't know if you were starting to form like a recommendation around that, or if you thought that what was in there sufficed or could be improved on, or if there's something else we should be considering.
It was more of an just kind of a general thought. Looking at the policy recommendation, actually, it kind of hits what I was getting at with more specificity in terms of, making specific requirements as to, reporting to public agencies who are using this technology, exactly why, and the suggesting amendments of the civil code. I think that encompasses kind of a lot of my concerns. My recommendation would be anything would be more general than that, but I think that's even more specific as to addressing kind of issues which I think are important.
Okay. And Board Member Sierra, you had also made some statements about balancing privacy protections and on body-worn cameras. And now looking at those recommendations, I wasn't clear on whether you thought that they were sufficient or whether something needed to be added or changed.
No, I think they're sufficient because we do call out, looking at potential recommendation number 6, call out that any legislation would need to also, protect active ongoing investigations, protect individually identifiable personal information, protect privacy rights and interests. So my thought was it's more about discussion in our report, that to the extent that we have guidance or ideas, or we can look at examples of like, how can the legislature accomplish that? Because I think those are pretty significant challenges. And so if there's anything, that we can point to that could help the legislature, if we're going to be asking them to enact this type of legislation. And if not, for us to be really clear that these, and really emphasize that these are significant issues. So it's more about the body of the report than the actual recommendation. And, and it may color, once we see what we come up with, how realistic our recommendation is, or should we alter it based on if we can maybe learn a little bit more about what maybe even academics or researchers are thinking about this area.
Great. And Board Member Kazi and Board Member Ford, you both brought up concerns around joint task forces. And I'm wondering if you see a need for anything additional or different. I don't see language around JTFs at all in the recommendations, and I'm wondering whether we should consider something. Board Member Ford.
Yeah, I think it's slightly piggybacking on what Board Member Diallo mentioned, and that is what feels to be the technology outpacing policy.
Are you pointing to a specific recommendation that we have, or more of a discussion in the content?
No, I think that somewhere around the area of the joint task force just needs some doubling down, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Board Member Kazi, do you have any thoughts on this, on whether?
Yeah, unfortunately, not at this point. As you stated at the beginning, I think it will depend on the context and fleshing out that section. So we know what is leading to this huge number of immigration-related arrests on these JTTF, or the joint task force. Excuse me.
Okay. All right. So maybe just a parking lot placeholder for possible additional recommendation related to that. Okay. I know we still have more longitudinal content to come. Board Member DeBard, you had shared your recommendations on how to clarify the relationship to prior policies. Did Any more specific thoughts on it? It might be too soon, but I just want to connect dots.
The short answer is no. No, I don't. I mean, of the thing of what DOJ's already identified, it's just the pretextual stop one jumped out at me just because I know, and this is particularly the case for LAPD. It's policy. While it did develop and adopt that policy does not 100% reflect the board's recommendation.
Right. Okay. Board Member Kazi.
Yes, thank you. On page, let's see, 15, it's section 3. It's the last full paragraph before the footnotes. It says, it's important for all California jurisdictions that use ALPR systems to take all reasonable measures to ensure that the data is not essentially being used for immigration enforcement purposes. If that is an actual recommendation, that should probably be pulled out as such. And then secondly, with that same language, I feel that the language is almost too permissive, and I would like to see it, even in this section of the report, say that these jurisdictions that use ALPR systems ensure their ALPR data is not being made available. I think take the qualifying statement to take all reasonable measures may allow for too much wiggle room. And I think having some bolder language there would be helpful.
Thank you. Board Member Kajabi?
Great, thank you. I just wanted to circle back to what I thought Board Member Dobard was suggesting for the longitudinal section. So if I'm understanding this as this section could include, here were past board recommendations relevant, for example, pretextual stops. Here are some examples of the actual local policy that was adopted. And then here's what the analysis shows, say for San Francisco, for Los Angeles. And I think that sounds great if that's where things were headed, because it will put the data in a context. And I just wanted to emphasize, pretextual stops, that there's a list of other possible elements to analyze: consent, search, use of force, and so on. That the use of consent has very much been a focus of ours in years past. So if push comes to shove, that's a topic I'd like us to really keep in for analysis in the longitudinal section. And I hope that's a section where we might see progress too. I know, for example, Board Member Randolph has said, okay, can we point to progress that's made? But in particular, I really like this structure without reiterating past recommendations. We don't want to be sort of shouting into the void, but that it's put in a context in this section. Thank you.
Yeah, I echo all that. I think we've seen big shifts in consent searches that are tied to policy changes. Great. Anything else that you want to provide input on at this juncture? Next up on our agenda is public comment, and for that, I will turn it back to my committee co-chair, Dobard.
Yeah, I will take that. But first, I saw Board Member Kajabi raised your hand. I don't know if you wanted to say another comment or ask a question.
I just wanted to add, I was really struck by the depth of the research in the report about the analysis being done from body camera footage. But at the same time, there are huge privacy concerns for those who are stopped, for officers. And so I think, this just reiterates concerns that were raised, but there's still a lot to hash out here about, what the right balance to strike is, or how to analyze information that's coming in, but in a way that really moves us forward in terms of the experience people are having and protects privacy. So I'm still admittedly sorting through, that section of the report and looking at, I really appreciated the many references that were cited there. So this is also a thank you to DOJ for this draft.
Got it. All right. Okay, well now, we now welcome public comment to address the subcommittee. And as a reminder, under Bagley-Keene, neither the board nor DOJ staff are required to respond to public comment, but can choose to do so. You can submit public comment by raising your hand in the Teams app, unmuting yourself if you're on the phone, or submitting public comment after the meeting via email. And you can send those emails to ab953@doj.ca.gov. Again, that's ab953@doj.ca.gov. All right, we will start with Northern California. Anyone from Northern California that wishes to provide public comment? Okay. And Michelle, I know you are Southern California, so I'm gonna wait for that. I'll wait for that. Anyone from Central California? Okay, we'll go to Southern California, and we'll start with you, Michelle.
Good afternoon, commissioners. It's Michelle Wittig in Santa Monica. I put in the chat a reference to a new article that has appeared in the Journal of Public Economics. It is titled Pretextual Stop, Restriction, and Policing, Evidence from Los Angeles. The paper analyzes data from the LAPD since it made stop policy reform in 2022. It focuses on racial disparities and policing outcomes following curbs on pretextual stops. I also put in the chat a reference to an LA Times article from last month indicating that the LA City Council passed a recommendation to further restrict pretextual stops. What I want to say in response to these two pieces of information is, it's my understanding this commission is concerned with racial profiling, a very difficult concept to measure and infer from data. One maybe proxy for addressing racial profiling is to look at racial disparities. However, in the larger sense, what we are all about, I think, is making sure that traffic stops are valid, justifiable, and efficient in the sense of actually detecting scofflaws or people who break the law. One very interesting aspect of the recently published article is that LAPD has experienced more efficient traffic stops. That is to say, traffic stops that actually detect what they are looking for. However, the data show that this stop policy reform has not reduced racial disparities. What do we learn from that? Racial disparities should be of concern because they are an indicator of possible inefficiency, injustice, I should say, and unjust stops. However, the larger goal is to ensure that stops themselves are valid, justifiable, and result in outcomes that find people who are breaking the law. So maybe it's a good idea for us to step back a little bit and take a look at why racial disparities are of concern. It's because they may be indicators of unjust stops. However, when we have data like we've got from LAPD, the reform resulted in more efficient and justifiable stops, but not necessarily racial disparities. how do we square that circle? Well, one of the other outcomes of that data is that the number of total stops was lower without having any connection with increased crime. So perhaps what LAPD is doing is really a good thing. And racial disparities may not be the be-all and end-all of measuring whether or not stops are actually efficient, justifiable, and valid. The good news is that stops have been reduced for all groups of people, so perhaps it's the best we can hope for. Fewer stops, but more efficient and better outcomes. So LAPD may be doing the right thing. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing those resources, and thank you for your comment. Anyone else from the public from Southern California that wishes to provide public comment? No? Okay. Well, in that case, we will move on to next steps. And those next steps include, so just to sum it up, DOJ continuing to update the policy section, particularly with the recommendations that we discussed today in mind. So that includes quite a bit around the joint task forces, what surveilling data they may have accessibility to, issues around privacy. So folks should anticipate we'll see an updated version with those things included at our next meeting. Co-chair Guerrero, anything I missed in terms of key next steps? That's it? Okay. So that is it. Thank you again, DOJ, for your hard work and this update. We look forward to the next version. Thank you to my fellow board members for your time, energy, and effort today. And thank you to the public for the same. And with that, we will adjourn. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.